year, kind of within months of the launch of the general strike, which was the first coordinated act of the resistance that would grow into the what we think of as the what's often called the Arab Revolt or the Palestine Revolt or the 1936 Revolution. Palestinians, we call it Thawrat al-36, the Revolution of 1936. Um, and his father was actually a lawyer. And so the household, even though he was quite young, but in these first years of his life, his house was constantly full of political figures, people who were facing prosecution and persecution by the British occupation authorities. Um, and and then at the age of 12, it's 1948, and the family is expelled northwards, and they're forced to flee, together with two-thirds of the Palestinian people in what's remembered as the Nakba, or the beginning of the Nakba. And they end up in Damascus. So his really formative years are spent as a refugee child in Damascus. And so that's actually where he ends up working as an art teacher. And his first writings were these short stories that if you read them, they're very autobiographical. They're quite hyper realist, and they're almost like he's taking notes on things that are happening around him. And this is the period where he is teaching art at the UNRWA school. UNRWA is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which the UN set up to provide assistance to Palestinian refugees. Um, Set up most of the initial refugee camps as well, and has come under very severe attack in the last 2 years. So he's using these short stories as a way of processing, and they actually kind of act, when we read them today, they can act as a kind of chronicle of what 1950s, early 1960s Syria, especially for Palestinians, looks and feels like. And also this young, very precocious, very intelligent public intellectual, how he's processing this. And you can see already the attentiveness to issues around class in particular, um, very much. And this kind of doubling of kind of being a refugee, meaning being poor, but being a refugee also being somehow other in the society that you're in, and the interplay of those things. Um, and he's a student activist at the University of Damascus, where he's studying literature. And he is expelled, from university for his activism. So in a lot of ways, I think we have a tendency to kind of take these figures like Kanafani and Fanon and Emma Goldman and whatnot, and sort of, and rightly put them on a pedestal, but maybe also in a way where we perhaps aren't noticing that they're also just kind of regular folk, right? That any one of us is kind of doing the sorts of things that somebody like a Kanafani or a Fanon or an Emma Goldman or whatnot are doing, in their early years and their middle years, and so on. So as a student activist, he's going on radio shows, he's organizing student exhibitions, he's doing lectures, and if film screenings were easier to organize, or Zoom meetings like this, then he would have been doing that as well, right? Um, but it's around this time that he has this fateful meeting with a medical student from Beirut called George Habash, who's also a Palestinian refugee. And George Habash and a group of other students at the American University of Beirut had started a youth group that they called the Youth of Revenge, and they wanted to take revenge on Israel. A feeling I think a lot of us have felt in the last 2 years in a very intense way. Um, but then they begin to kind of think more politically. They think more about organizing and what organizing means. And under the influence of a Lebanese professor of history at the American University of Beirut called Constantin Zreik, who's actually the person who coined the word Nakba. He wrote a book called The Meaning of the Nakba shortly after the war. And that word kind of stuck as the way people referred to the 1948 war. And so they started to form. This was a group of students who weren't just Palestinian. They were actually from all over the Arab world, including Kuwait and Iraq. So they start a formation called the Movement of Arab Nationalists, which you'll also sometimes see referred to as the Arab Nationalist Movement. Um, and Habash realizes that Kanafani has a clarity with words. He's not the most eloquent writer, right? He's not a flowery writer. He's not trying to excavate words nobody remembers or uses anymore, which is a mode of kind of belles lettres writing in Arabic that's very, very prized and esteemed. Um, Kanafani's writing is actually very economic. It's really pulled back. It's like you feel like he's written something and then edited it down to the most succinct version that he can bring it down to convey his point. Although we can say more about this later, because sometimes it can be a bit deceptively simple seeming. Um, and so Habash asked him if he would want to be part of the editorial committee of the main newspaper for the party, for the movement, which was called the Ra'i, the opinion. Um, and Kanafani says yes. And so this is kind of his beginning as an editor. And really, he's remembered primarily as a writer of fictional works like Men in the Sun and Return to Haifa and All That's Left to You and Saad. Um, but as well as an artist and as an analyst and as a member of the Popular Front and so on. But I think one of his major, major contributions really is as an editor. And it's kind of fascinating in a way because we don't usually, like when we think about famous writers and we think about famous political leaders and we think about, influential doctors even and stuff, but rarely do we think about like who are the well-known editors, who are these editors that like who's the list of famous celebrity editors. Um, and you have to be actually really quite in the know to even list more than two or three, I think. Um, uh, so so that this is a part, and also because editors' work is really, really quite invisible, right? It's you generally don't know what an editor has done. You see their name maybe in at the beginning of a publication or something like this. Um, but are they just kind of like fixing the syntax and language, or is there more to it? And obviously, there's more to it. And actually, this kind of work of editor is what follows Kanafani around until his death. So from this moment until the Israelis kill him in 1972, he's at any given point a senior editor, if not editor in chief, of at least one publication, while also contributing both written material but also editorial advice to multiple publications. All of them, the common denominator being that they're part of this revolutionary moment and this revolutionary movement. Um, and by this, I mean the Palestinian liberation movement, but really actually a very pan-Arab and even kind of third worldist, global South, anti-imperialist movement. And I'll touch on some of this a little later on as well. Um, but having come on hard times and kind of having difficulty finding a job as a teacher in Damascus, one of the great mentors of his life and one of the great kind of almost like parental figure in his life is his older sister, who's also in a lot of ways like written out of his story. Uh, but she's a huge influence on his life, Faiza. And she goes with her husband to Kuwait and she finds him a job in Kuwait. And so he moves to Kuwait initially, I think, as a teacher and then gets a job as an editor there. Um, and he's becoming more and more senior as an editor. And what you see from his later publications is something that he starts to really put a lot of emphasis on, which is these few things. So one thing that I think is really important to note about Kanafani is the way that he approaches the kind of letters to the editor section. In every publication that he either joined or established himself, this turns into a kind of public forum. It's not just like somebody's, something where you send in a few lines where you say, so and so wrote this article a couple of issues back, and like, they were wrong on this point or something like this. It was about giving space to actually recreate this letters to the editor section so you could have long form responses, and to turn the publication itself into something that is like a public forum. And why this is really important in the Palestinian case in particular is because from 1948 onwards, the kind of imperial and Zionist assault on the region, but on the Palestinian people in particular, has had this primary effect of fragmentation. So when we think about Palestinians today, for instance, you have the kind of, the West Bank Palestinians, the Gaza Palestinians, the 48 Palestinians, and the diaspora. And then within each of these groups, you also have further fragmentation. Within the West Bank, you have all of this kind of like Bantustanization. Gaza was historically split up into three parts for a few decades. 48 Palestine, the Israelis have implemented policies to divide people socially along almost like it's not even sector. There's kind of Bedouin, Druze, Muslim. So these kind of like constructed identities that the Israelis have tried to really politicize and add a kind of political valence to. And then within the diaspora, of course, you have all of the different geographies, and then all of the different kind of like, are you a camp Palestinian in Lebanon? Or are you outside of the camp? Are you middle class? Are you Christian and therefore got citizenship at some point? Or are you not? And so, unlike with many national liberation struggles, where, if you think of Algeria or Vietnam or even South Africa, or any at all, there isn't this same kind of fragmentation, this inability to communicate, like utter inability. Because, after 1948, for instance, Israel classified all the Arab states as enemy entities, and all the Arab states classified Israel as an enemy entity. So you couldn't even make a phone call. You couldn't send mail. You couldn't ship somebody a gift or a book. Publications were considered illegal. And so it was very, very difficult to move information around. And then you also had all of these Arab borders start to become increasingly hardened over time. The Syrians and the Iraqi, the two Ba'ath parties are at loggerheads. Algeria and Morocco are at war, and so on. And so these publications become a place where people are able to have the conversation of who are we? Where did we come from? What are we about? What is this revolution? What is our liberation strategy? What are our tactics? What is the role of culture in this? What are, who are our poets? Who are our public intellectuals? This new peace plan or this new proposal, what do we make of it? So all of these kinds of really burning questions, instead of having this one-way communication from an editorial team and a group of writers out to the readership, it becomes this two-way communication. And I think for millennials and after, we don't fully necessarily understand just how important this is, because it's effectively doing what social media kind of does in that public forum way. I mean, we can talk about algorithms and how that's also skewed and whatnot, but the key point being that when we're talking about pre-1990s, all of television and radio is one way, right? It's usually state media that's then broadcast out. And so it's not a place where you can come in and get your voice in. And that's the same with the newspapers. They're all kind of national. You might have opposition newspapers being published abroad, but then that would mean that they're banned locally. And so these kind of Palestinian publications that Kanafani was a part of become some of the very few avenues for people to engage, not just as consumers, but in this kind of dialogic process, where you get to write in, you get to see your perspective that the editors disagree with, but given space, and then somebody else coming in and engaging with it. So this is one. The second thing is that Kanafani, yes, he was an artist and a short story writer and a novelist, And some of his long form nonfiction writing, two books in particular on Zionist literature and on resistance literature, are works of literary analysis and cultural studies, really, cultural studies before that was actually a discipline. Um, uh, what he's doing with the magazines is really giving them a lot of cultural meat. So most of these if you look at the magazines of the Palestinian revolutionary factions and liberation movements in general, you'll find a lot of it is really this kind of like the some kind of leadership, some kind of vanguard, Politburo, pumping a certain kind of political line and analysis out into the readership. And then discussions of current affairs, updates on battles, things like this. What Kanafani made sure to really emphasize in all of the publications that he was leading was you started to get a lot more book reviews. You got a lot more even reviews of plays and theatrical performances, discussions of film, um, and really discussions, right? Because once again, everybody was encouraged to write in a response if they had also read this book, if they had also watched this play. The other thing that Kanafani was doing, and this really is also in part due to the internationalism of the Palestinian movement, right? So as of 1968, you have people coming from all over the world to be part of this movement, but also to receive training in this movement. So you have, LTTE like Tamil Tigers, Kurdish fighters, people from all over the struggles in Latin America and the African continent, um, coming in either to be trained, to offer training, or to come and just sign up as part of the Palestinian Revolution, right? So, and especially in the Popular Front, in the leftist factions. And so Kanafani is actually constantly surrounded, especially in these years in the 1960s and the beginning of the 70s. His office physically, which many of you have probably seen the pictures of his office, where he has all of those posters and photos of people like Ho Chi Minh and Che Guevara and whatnot. But that actual office was constantly full of revolutionary and cultural figures from all over the world. And so you can see this in the publications he was a part of as an editor, because you'll see that he's soliciting writing from revolutionary intellectuals and activists and organizers from all over the world, a lot of it on matters cultural. Um, and he's also ensuring translation of articles. So, you can almost imagine the conversation leading to the publication of a piece where somebody from Nicaragua will say, well, have you seen so and so's piece on the relationship of, public theater and revolutionary movements? And Kanafani will say, get me a copy and I'll have it translated and we'll put it in the next issue, right? So there's a lot of this kind of content in the magazines that kind of and more so as we move into closer to the late 60s and early 70s. So this is Kanafani as an editor. And so when the Arab nationalist movement, after 1967, the Arab nationalist movement, it's not exactly that it's split, it kind of evolved focus areas and two very primary ones. One being the Popular Front for the Liberation of Oman and the Arabian Gulf, which led a sustained revolutionary movement that actually liberated the vast majority of the territory of the Sultanate of Oman. From the late 60s, but like reaching its peak in the 1970s, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And so Kanafani was immediately one of the head people of the kind of media office of the PFLP and the chief editor of its magazine Al Hadaf, which really those were kind of exemplary years of that magazine, that periodical. And then there's the kind of literary work that he's doing. So one thing to note is that Kanafani was diagnosed with a terminal illness in his early 20s, and it only kind of got worse. And so, by all accounts, especially the account of his wife, his widow, Annie, he was kind of in a race against time. He thought that this illness was going to kill him any day. And so he was actually kind of astoundingly prolific, right? If we just take the editing work on its own, um, it's already a full-time job for all of those years. Especially when we consider that he wrote a lot of the content under different pen names and pseudonyms. And if any of you have ever edited a sizable publication, you know that feeling of like, I really need an article on this. But as the editor, I can't also write it because then I'll have written half the thing. So then you kind of write it under somebody else's name. But he was doing that all the time. We know of at least 12 pen names that he used. We don't know all of the pen names that he used. So actually, sort of complete works of Ghassan Kanafani is possibly impossible. So that's something also to kind of keep in mind in terms, and I think a lot of the treasure of his production is actually the articles he wrote, which um, have generally not been collected, but this recent publication from American University of Cairo Press, which is called Ghassan Kanafani Selected Political Writings, edited by Louis Breoni and Tahrir Hamdi, brings together some of that work. An excellent place to start. Also, they've structured it in this beautiful way where they have a kind of a different translator for each piece, but then they have somebody with a connection to the contents of the piece, write an introduction to each piece. So you also get that beautiful context for each of the pieces in here. So we have his. So then there's his fiction writing. So I mentioned the short stories, but the longer, and he also wrote these audio plays that were intended for radio, that kind of very rarely get talked about. But in a way, like they're somewhat less interesting than the novellas. And the novellas are probably what he's most known for, especially the novella he wrote in the mid 60s, early mid 60s, called Men in the Sun, Rijal fi Shams. And this is his first kind of hit in a way. This really introduces him to the Arab reading public as a literary figure. And I think many of you will know the story. Three Palestinian men from different walks of life are trying to get to Kuwait. This story also resonates quite highly with me because my father was one of these men, not the ones in the book, obviously, but one of these people who tried to make his way to Kuwait in the mid 1960s because there were jobs there, and the idea was you go, you get a job in Kuwait, and you send money home. A pretty familiar story to most migrant families, I think. Or many migrant families. And the story is really about a kind of, you can really sense his distrust of Arab regimes, right? And who have set up these borders to the point where Palestinians have to hide in water tanks in order to go and actually like just work in your oil fields. But then also a particular attitude towards the people claiming to be the Palestinian leadership, right? So the driver of this truck he's not a bad man per se. He's really trying to help these guys out. There's this very kind of on the nose metaphor in the book, which is that this driver was castrated as a result of a battle injury, and so his like manhood has been taken from him, with all of what that represents. Um, but then it's kind of like there's this key moment at the end of the story where Abul Khayzaran, this driver character who works for the oil sheikhs of Kuwait, he gets held up at the last border crossing, the last border checkpoint. And he gets held up because the Kuwaiti border guards want him to share lewd stories of the nightlife in Baghdad that they assume he's just come back from, right? So they want him to talk about the women he's slept with and the alcohol he's consumed and this kind of thing. And so it's this very powerful moment. Like I don't want to kind of spell out all of what's in that, but the thing that kind of kills these men in the water tank is the combination of this inept, unable Palestinian leadership in with these Arab regimes that are really quite insistent on maintaining their little nation states, whether it's Kuwait or Jordan or Iraq, and those borders applying to other Arabs, um, and a kind of debauchery, right? Like a prioritizing of the lewd over the real, in a way, or over the pressing. People's lives in the water tank in the middle of the scorching desert. Um, and then the thing that sort of is this punchline of the book, that if you've ever seen the film version, the dupes is taken out of the film and replaced with something else. But it's kind of the line from the book is that when Abu Khayzaran, the driver, the Palestinian leadership, opens the tank and sees that they've all effectively been killed, they're all dead, he says, "Why didn't you bang on the tank? Why didn't you bang on the walls of the water tank?" Um, as if, had they banged, something else would have been different. But then this banging, this resistance, is the thing that is clearly missing, right? Is that even this leadership is saying, like, why don't you resist, even though they're the ones supposed to be leading this? And so this begins the kind of novella's story. So that Men in the Sun, in a lot of ways, is that kind of inaugural one. And it's written in this point where there really isn't, this is before the formation of the PLO, this is before there's a kind of armed Palestinian resistance or an organized Palestinian resistance. The resistance in the 1950s and early 60s is very ad hoc, small groupings of people who manage to find ways to access weapons or explosives, carrying out rogue operations here and there, but nothing really organized to speak of. Um, by the mid 1960s, this is starting to change, and we get a change in the novellas, the novels that he writes. So we have kind of two really important novels that emerge in the late 1960s, and these are All That Remains to You and Saad. So All That Remains to You is about this brother and sister in Gaza. They're refugees in Gaza. And they know that there's a kind of a resistance brewing in Jordan. Um, and I mean, it's a bit of an intricate story, but the story is actually about a collaborator. Like in a lot of ways, the main character is this sort of villain figure who marries the sister because he's gotten her pregnant. And he's a collaborator with the Israelis. And the kind of like climactic moment of the story is the killing of the collaborator, right? And here, this is really about kind of an honest appraisal of Palestinian society, and who's in this for the fight for liberation, and who's in this and is wanting to kind of enrich themselves and getting in the way of liberation, which is going to be a theme that sort of both carries over in his work, especially in the book about the 1936 revolution, but then really carries over in the Palestinian struggle, right? The kind of collaborationist arm, the reactionary Palestinian leadership, is actually an evolution of Abu Khayzaran from Men in the Sun, the truck driver from Men in the Sun, the Palestinian leadership character, who goes from inept to downright and outright treasonous, outright in the way, outright on, like allying themselves with the enemy, wittingly and or unwittingly. And this is, I mean, in terms of just like this week, even, we have with the kind of Yasser Abu Shabab group in Gaza, the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, and so on, the importance and centrality of understanding collaborationism in Palestinian society, especially in the Palestinian political class, is crucial. And Kanafani, to the best of his ability, was really the person who opened the door to this analysis, right? And when I say to the best of his ability, I'm talking about with vanguardist political party organizing, it's very difficult to step outside of the party line. even if you're one of the people who's writing the party line, as Kanafani kind of was. And so there had to be always a very careful tightrope walking when talking about such things as collaborationism, when talking about reactionary Arab regimes that maybe were also kind of funding some parts of the liberation movement. Or if you wanted to critique something like the Soviet Union, for example, and your faction was in some way beholden to this kind of, like Stalinist empire. But Kanafani was very brave in that way, and also he could use things like the pen names, he could use things like unpublished writings, and could really use things like the literature, the fiction, as a space in which to put those ideas, which maybe he would not have been able to so explicitly do as Ghassan Kanafani, the editor of Al Hadaf, one of the leaders in the media committee of the faction, somebody who's very much affiliated and identified with the faction. And so the literary writing becomes a space through which to level those critiques, and to kind of add to that toolbox, that revolutionary analytical toolbox, that he is trying to engage the broader society with. The other book, that's kind of the third book here, Saad, so Mother of Saad, is for me one of the most powerful books that he writes. And this is a book that, it's almost memoirish in a way. He's in a camp in Beirut. So this is him. And there's a cleaning lady who gets paid by several people in the area to kind of like clean the stairwells in the homes. This is really somebody who is a real person, that he and his family paid to help clean their house. And she was facing this dilemma of the fact that her son wanted to join the revolution, which meant that there was a very good chance he would be injured or killed, right? And no parent would want this. And this is what she's struggling with, but then she's struggling with it with such a wisdom and such a realness and such an understanding that Ghassan Kanafani, who's spending all of his days talking to some of the leading intellectuals all over the world, like he's literally all day in discussion with these, Jean Genet stature intellectuals. And it dawns on him that, like, actually, Saad has taught him at least as much as any of these highfalutin intellectuals, which is no shade on the intellectuals, right? But what it is it's kind of shade on anybody who talks down to the masses, right? And again, a lot of people have big beef with me for talking about Kanafani as critical of Marxism, Leninism, and vanguardist organizing, and even Stalinism. Oh, heaven forbid we critique Stalinism. He, but it's there, right? Like you can see in Lenin, for instance, a real snobbery when it comes to talking about the vanguard being 10 steps ahead of the masses, and the masses being this like idiotic sack of potatoes that needs to be organized and told, you are the workers, organized so that we can make revolution. Kanafani is saying, no, like Saad, and there's a Maxim Gorky thing. Like, this isn't even something that's like all communists think this way. Just Lenin really was a snob. Um, but the but he's basically saying Saad is a teacher. We political leaders and intellectuals and so on, we cannot allow ourselves to fall into the trap of seeing the people as anything less than the people who actually, like, the revolution is for them, the revolution is by them, the revolution is them, but also the revolution is guided by their consciousness and their knowledge. Someone like Saad knows exactly what the political dynamics are of what it means for her son to join the revolutionary movement as a fighter. She knows on the level of the Cold War politics of US versus Soviet Union, down to the Lebanese sectarian politics and the politics of being a refugee in Lebanon and a Palestinian in Lebanon, down to the social dynamics of the camp, down to what it means for us to fight back in order to get Palestine back. She sees all of this very, very clearly. Actually, she sees this a lot more clearly than someone coming in trying to load it with European philosophers and Hegel this and Foucault that, right? Um, so Saad is really just a reminder that we look up to the masses as organizers. If there is such a thing as the masses or the people, then that's something we look up to, not down on, that we're trying to drag up. Um, and um, and then the last novella he writes is called Returning to Haifa, which again is actually very kind of original thing for somebody who's a leader in an armed Palestinian faction to come out to put out. Basically, after the 1967 occupation, if you were in the West Bank or Gaza, this was the first time you could actually cross what's known as the Green Line, the 1949 armistice lines, and go into the part of Palestine that was occupied in 1948. And so the main characters are this couple who were expelled in the Nakba, became refugees, and now they're driving home to Haifa, to their old house to see what's left of it. And as the story goes on, we find out that they had to kind of abandon their baby son in the bombing. And so they're kind of holding their breath, wondering if this return is going to kind of give them a sense of what happened to their child. And they go to their house, and the Jewish Israeli family that's in their house is very kind and invites them in for tea. And then their son sort of walks in, and it turns out it's going to be his first day at the army, and he's in full military fatigues. And we basically find out that this is the Palestinian couple's biological son, right? He's the baby that they left behind. And so this Jewish Israeli family not only took the house and the furniture and the photographs that they're seeing all over the living room, but also their flesh and blood child, and raised him Israeli. And here he is going to basically at some point be stationed in the West Bank, and might even kill his father or mother in the course of, or at least ask them for their IDs if he's stationed at a checkpoint. Um, and here there's this like very profound kind of thing about identity, that identity isn't blood. It's not what you're born into. It's not your DNA. It's really your chosen identity. It's really, identity is a set of choices. It's a set of political choices that you make. Um, so that's on the novellas. On the nonfiction is some of like the real treasures of what he leaves for us, what he gives to us. And three books really in particular. Um, the These two he's working on at around the same time. So this one is actually translated into English, but the translation is not out yet. And it's called Palestinian Resistance Literature Under Occupation, 1948 to 1968. And just a little bit of backdrop on this. So remember, I was saying already that after 1948, there's this kind of iron curtain that falls between the part of Palestine that was occupied in 1948 and the rest of the Arab world. So those Palestinians who managed to remain within what became 1948 occupied Palestine, or under Israeli occupation from 48 to 67, 68, there's really like very little ability to communicate between them and the rest of the Arab world. And there's this kind of like suspicion that grows that these Palestinians on the inside, they've learned Hebrew, they're acclimating to these Zionist ways. And so maybe they're collaborators. Maybe there's a question mark on these, they'll start to be called Arab Israelis. And maybe like adopt some aspects of Israeli identity. And there's something to that. Like if we wanted to read kind of like Black Skin, White Masks, like the kind of Fanonian logic of colonialism, of the native wanting to adopt the ways of the colonizer, and starting to internalize some of that colonial logic of the colonial superiority. That dynamic has been there with Palestinians under the kind of 1948 occupation, because they are being kind of like pumped Hebrew language, Israeli curricula. There was this major kind of identity conflict, at least until the 90s. The only political formation you could really join, that was a legal political formation if you were a Palestinian citizen of Israel, was the Communist Party, which always adopted the Soviet line of two states for two people. They go down on Nakba Day. They used to go down to like Nakba Day demonstrations carrying Israeli flags. Um, but Kanafani basically says no, like we need to also recognize that the resistance is still strong in 48 and it's operating on this cultural level. I've mentioned a lot about kind of the importance of culture for Kanafani, but just to kind of make sure that it's said, for Kanafani, there's no point to carrying a rifle as a revolutionary if you don't have cultural understanding to understand why you're carrying that rifle and what you're carrying it for and where you're trying to go with this. So for him, culture operated as the realm through which a true revolutionary subjectivity could be formed, and a kind of and that cultural production and engagement with cultural production, especially revolutionary cultural production, would create the social um, embrace. We call it al-hadina. Al-hadina can be translated as a kind of cradle, but really, it's much more accurately, it's to think of it as society's ability to embrace the revolutionary movement, to hold it, to nurture it, to enable it, which also means things like to very kind of practical things like to feed it, to hide someone when they're on the run, to find a surgeon to operate on them when the hospitals are being monitored, um, to understand that there's going to be when because also the Israelis, thanks to the training of the British, actually used collective punishment as a technique of terrorizing the Palestinian population for any individual act of resistance, let alone collective acts of resistance, right? So we know that this fighter emerged from this village, go and punish the entire village, terrorize the entire village. And so without having this kind of revolutionary cultural production and to create a revolutionary subjectivity and a revolutionary culture, then your revolution is doomed to failure, because you need the people to embrace the revolution. Um, and so this book is actually an analysis of resistance literature. He coins that term um, in this book. And what he does in it, and again, this is how his role as an editor has enabled him to find these people. But he goes through the resistance literature that's emerging from 48 Palestine, right? Names nobody had really heard, but some of which become household names because they include names like Samih al-Qasim, they include names like Mahmoud Darwish, they include names like Emil Habibi, they include names like Tawfiq Zayyad. So people who are now considered the canon of Palestinian, this is the book that canonizes them effectively. But doesn't just say like, hey, here are these people. It's actually his biggest book. Um, uh, he goes through, he's reprinting their writings. He's doing a meticulous analysis of what they're doing with their writings, whether it's, I mean, a lot of it is poetry, but also prose. Um, and so, in a way, he's introducing the Arabic readership, or readers of Arabic, to this completely isolated cultural scene of these besieged Palestinians who've been living under Israeli occupation since 1948 and who've been cut off from the depth of Arab society. And he's saying, here they are, and here's what they're about. And by the way, what they're about is revolution. What they're about is resistance, not what you kind of have been assuming. But then there's this other masterpiece on Zionist literature, which Hussein had kind of mentioned. Zionist literature is written kind of on both sides of the 1967 war. He starts it, I think, in either late 1966 or early 1967 and finishes it right after the war. And it should be on every cultural studies syllabus as a key text of cultural studies. There's nothing in this book that I mean, this book is on par with that kind of cultural studies canon of Bertolt Brecht through Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall, and Michel Foucault on a level. Because what he's doing here, unlike the kind of Frankfurt School people who are really obsessed with ideology and kind of like taking a text and being like, what word is he using? Let's do a discourse analysis. It's much more Brechtian. It's looking at the apparatus of cultural production, right? It's not interested just in what words are being used or what omissions are made or whatnot. It's very much looking at the industry that produces culture. So just a sense of what I'm using this notion of apparatus of cultural production from Bertolt Brecht, who was this revolutionary playwright in Germany during the rise of fascism, the last round of rise of fascism um, in the 1920s and 30s. So, when you go into a bookshop, sometimes you'll buy a book because of the cover or you've heard of something, but usually you kind of have been told what to read, who's won the awards, who's being talked about in the reviews. Sometimes you pick up a book and it'll kind of tell you like who's blurbing it. Again, it'll talk about its accolades. These are the kinds of things that often play a pretty big role in which books have been turned into movies, this kind of thing. So this is the sort of stuff that you want to think of when you think of the apparatus of cultural production. When Brecht was writing about it, he's saying whose plays get performed, reviewed, staged, what kind of reviews they're going to get, and then you have the awards circuit, the impresarios, what logic is driving them, this kind of thing. So Kanafani is basically, he's like, there's a lot of writing about Palestine, Israel, all of this stuff. But then how does Zionism figure into this? And this is one of the first books to really look at the roots of Zionism in evangelical Christian Zionism, which still is not, if we think about Christian Zionism, there's still really not enough writing to say like we really understand what this is. Gabriel Pauly's book about Victorian Zionism is a really good one. I don't know if anyway, I can send the reference to later to be sent out. But basically Zionism starts out as a purely Christian evangelical movement, right? And it's an anti-Semitic movement. It's a movement to like, how do we get rid of the Jews? Have them fulfill prophecy by going to Palestine, so that when the Messiah returns, they'll either convert to Christianity or we burn them along with all the other infidels. But what's fascinating about Christian Zionism is it turns the anti-Semitic tropes around kind of like a Shylock type of character. So the money hoarding, control the world and the banks, like all of the nonsense around anti-Semitic tropes. It actually turns the Jewish character into a very virtuous character, right? So this is where we talk about someone like Robert Louis Stevenson or George Eliot's Daniel Deronda, or with Stevenson, it's the character of I think in Ivanhoe, it's Rebecca. But you have these virtuous Jewish characters, but there's this kind of little subtext of there's something wrong with their virtue because it shouldn't be here in Europe. It should be over there in Palestine. And this is really, really thick in Daniel Deronda, to the point where George Eliot has streets named after her in Israeli cities. I think there's even Daniel Deronda streets in some of the Israeli cities, because this was really a foundational moment in the European literary canon for what Kanafani calls literary Zionism. And he kind of follows this through to this blockbuster book that if there are like some of the people on here might be old enough to remember this book, Exodus. And Exodus was not just a blockbuster of a book, it was made into a Hollywood blockbuster of a movie. And it effectively is the foundational statement of the notion that Zionism was a liberation movement of the Jewish people who fought against imperial powers to achieve their liberation on the land to which they returned after 2,000 years. And it's too bad that some Arabs got in the way. And that really becomes the way that most Americans, most people watching Hollywood films understand Palestine. It becomes the lens and the filter, and it wins all the awards, and the apparatus really kind of like holds it up. Another interesting chapter in this book is about the person who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1966. So as Kanafani is writing this book, and I think actually that's what spurs him to like the rage around the fact that this award went to this guy, is what spurred Kanafani to write this book because nobody's heard of him. Like by any account, he's at best a mediocre novelist. And actually, the chapter just kind of like goes through how mediocre he is of a novelist. I've talked about this several times. I've read this book a few times, and I can never really remember his name. Um, but but maybe somebody can look it up and let me know. But or you can look up like who won the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Literature Prize in 1966, and you can tell us. Um, so this is really a foundational text of that kind of cultural studies approach, of understanding culture through the apparatus, not just through its products, as a kind of analysis of ideology. And then last but not least is the last book he wrote, the book that I had the honor to translate, The Revolution of 1936 to 1939 in Palestine, where he not only, I mean, it's an exemplary materialist history in the sense of like, how does a historian approach a moment, by giving priority to a class analysis? And then how does that enrich an analysis? So on a methodological level, this is as good as it gets for a kind of materialist history of a moment, especially something so succinct, and small. Um, but it also makes some really crucial arguments because, for instance, it opens with one of its most crucial arguments where he basically says, the reason I wrote this book is I wanted to find out where the constellation of enemies that we're facing, where did they all come together? Who are they? And when did they all come together? And he says, we have to look at 1936. That's when they all come together. And who is they? And he basically lists them in order. And the order he lists them in is very crucial because he basically says, number one, it's the reactionary Palestinian leadership. Number two, it's the reactionary Arab dictatorships. And number three is the alliance of Zionism and imperialism, right? And it's kind of the least important because we already knew the alliance of Zionism and imperialism was this major enemy. But what we're not factoring into our analysis nearly enough is the role of reactionary Arab regimes and the people who really get off the hook all the time, to the point where we'll even share videos of them not condemning Hamas, right? Like the actual ambassador of the reactionary Ramallah regime gets treated as a liberation hero, as do many, many others, is the reactionary Palestinian leadership, right? And so he's basically looking at the interplay of the Palestinian elite, the Arab elite, but really the Palestinian elite with the imperial project. Um, and along the way make some pretty crucial arguments and analyses, both in terms of the political economy of Zionism, the ways that the British fostered a kind of a modern industrial capitalist state with socialist trappings in the form of Israel, but basically through these extremely exclusionary policies of excluding Palestinians and funneling opportunities and contracts towards what was called the Jewish sector. But then the other thing that I really love about this book is he effectively takes what we can think of as two revolutionary narrative arcs, the kind of class revolution narrative arc that we find in Marx and Lenin, and then the kind of anti-colonial revolutionary arc that we can find in Fanon, and shows why Palestine doesn't follow that narrative arc. So the class revolutionary arc, following Marx and Lenin, is that we have the capitalist mode of production, and the working class kind of almost like produces a vanguard leadership that then organizes the working class into a working class, a class that sees itself as a class and sees its only option to kind of like overthrow the class structure of society and towards creating a classless society. And he actually opens the book with that, right? The first chapter is on the workers. And he shows that the kind of this vanguard, this Communist Party, was almost exclusively Jewish. And these Jewish comrades figure out way too late that in order to really be representative of the working class, they need to organize with Arab workers as well, not just Jewish workers. Um, but it's kind of too little, too late. And so even though some of them end up playing very important roles in the revolution, they're in no position to kind of lead the working class in this revolutionary moment. And note, at no point does he disqualify them just because they're Jewish, right? That's not the issue here, right? It's not like because the communists were Jewish, therefore, or they were useless or something like this. It's really that like he sees them as the comrades of the time. These were the people who saw their whose historical task was to organize the working class, and yet they failed because they only focused on one sector of the working class and realized this way too late and did too little too late. Insofar as Palestinian workers were getting organized, it was the Palestinian reactionary leadership who assassinated those leaders, right? The same Mufti who then goes Nazi and becomes Hitler's Mufti, Amin al-Husseini, before he does that, he's one of the most important leaders in Palestine of the feudal clerical landowning elite, and who are begging for the Brits to make them the leaders. Um, He's also selected by the British to be the Mufti, by the way. He's way too young to have been the Mufti, but they saw him as pliant and therefore very acceptable. And so they arranged for him to become this leading religious figure. Um, but he sees these labor organizers as major threats, and so he has them assassinated. Um, and it's also interesting that like Palestinian elite organizations to this day will celebrate Amin al-Husseini as an important Palestinian historical figure with zero critique about his Nazism or the way that he kind of colluded with the Nazis and offered himself up as a Nazi effectively. And also will remain silent about the devastating effects that his campaign against the labor leaders had on Palestinian society. The second narrative arc that we kind of find in Fanon and kind of post-colonial studies and stuff like this is that you have a national liberation movement, anti-colonial movement that emerges, and then the elites within the native society will try to find common cause with the colonizer, right? Will kind of say, look, we know our revolution is being really expensive and costly to you. We're running this stuff. We can make it die down. We can make it go away. We know you have interests here, resources, the port, some coal, whatever it is. We know you need some stuff here. You tell us what you need, and we'll make sure you get that. And then you ensure that we get to maintain our privilege by setting up our little dictatorship here. Um, and so, if you, and you can really look at almost any national liberation movement where the new regime kind of sustained itself, right? So we're not talking about Patrice Lumumba. He remains a threat. This, European intelligence agencies come and kill him. But someone like Habib Bourguiba in Tunis is exactly this, right? He basically, France maintains all of its privileges and needs. In post-colonial Tunisia, Bourguiba comes in and gets to establish a clientelism network that ensures his and his coteries privilege all the way to the Ben Ali regime before it was toppled by the Tunisian Revolution in 2011, and is kind of making a comeback now, right, with this new sort of dictatorship. Um, but practically any kind of big national liberation movement will follow this. And Fanon had predicted this in The Wretched of the Earth when he talks about the pitfalls of national consciousness. He's already kind of telling us that this is going to happen. He's already seeing it in Algeria before Algeria is even liberated. That this is how this is going to go. But in the case of Palestine, Kanafani tells us the elite, the Palestinian elites, are actually like secretly traveling to London and begging the British for any scraps off the table, just saying, "Look, we'll do whatever. Like, just give us the lowest cost. Give us any offer. We'll take it." But the British have no interest to do that because they have another leadership that they find, the Zionist leadership is going to fulfill that for them. So why would they listen to someone like Amin Husseini or Raghib al-Nashashibi if they have David Ben Gurion? And the combination of white supremacy, the whole kind of notion of Judeo-Christianity, and the fact that these are Europeans, that they're going to be beholden to the British Empire, um, all render the Zionist and also Britain's own anti-Semitism, right? This whole kind of evangelical Zionism, we can't downplay it, right? When you think about, so like another person who has a street named after him in every Israeli city is Lord Arthur Balfour, Bloody Balfour, Butcher Balfour, who was colonial secretary. So a lot of people around the world have beef with Balfour, including in Ireland, including in Scotland, including in India. But in Palestine, the Balfour Declaration is pretty famous. But in 1905, Balfour leads the charge in parliament. So in 1905, there's a major uprising in the Russian Empire. Some people even call it the 1905 Revolution or the First Russian Revolution. Um, but among the consequences of the clampdown on that, because some of the most kind of powerful revolutionary movements in the Russian Empire was the Jewish revolutionaries, the Bund in particular, in kind of Ukraine. And so the Tsarist response was really to intensify what were called pogroms, these kind of big massacre attacks on Jewish communities. And so while there were pogroms before and kind of like waves of Jewish refugees, in 1905 there was a mass wave of Jewish refugees. And so this was if we go back to the British newspapers in 1905, a lot of it is what do we do with the refugees? It's kind of like this whole send back the boats kind of thing that we have today. Um, and it's led by Arthur Balfour in Parliament, right? This whole notion of like not a single Jew allowed in. We don't want any of these refugees. They're Jewish and they're destitute, like the two great sins of Jewishness and poverty. So this is kind of, I mean, if this isn't anti-Semitic, I don't know what is, sort of, right? But you have this current in British politics, which is this kind of evangelical Zionism of, yes, Jews can be people too, just as long as they do it somewhere in Palestine. If they do it somewhere else, ideally in Palestine, because that way it's fulfilling prophecy. Um, and so, for these kinds of reasons, the British are going to prefer the Zionist leadership over any kind of Arab leadership, no matter the sort of class dynamics of that. So I think I've spoken for quite a bit of time, and I want to leave some room for discussion. Um, yeah, and I guess anything else I want to say can come out in that. So thank you for your patience and for sticking around. I hope some of this has been useful.
Thank you so much, Hazem. That is so fascinating, and what you've covered in such a short space of time about the multifaceted life of Kanafani and how critical he is to so much is really amazing. Thank you. We're going to go straight through. We're not going to have a break, but feel free if you need to like have a break to have a break whenever. Does anyone have any like initial questions for Hazem or like thoughts more generally about Kanafani?
You're also welcome to use the chat if you don't want to speak. That's fine.
Well, maybe I'll start with a little question, which is when you were talking, I was thinking about Kanafani said somewhere that it was actually through the process of writing fiction that that was his politicization. And I was kind of thinking about that in relation to what you were discussing about on Zionist literature and also about that idea of the kind of cultural cradle or the embrace as something which can therefore produce kind of revolutionary subjectivity. So I was just wondering like how you see that or whether you can illuminate a bit further the way that his process of writing fiction and how that relates to, revolutionary subjectivity.
That's a really great question. I obviously can't. There's always a risk of kind of like ventriloquizing someone who's not here, right? And I've tried in the presentation at least to kind of stick to the sources, but now we're entering a more speculative realm, I think. So yeah, I know the quote you're talking about, something like, I didn't become a novelist because I was a revolutionary. I became a revolutionary because I was a novelist, kind of vibe to it. And I think it's because when you come to produce, to somehow speak to society on the page, using words, you have to kind of start thinking about character, about context, about processes, about people's motivations individually and collectively, and all of the contradictions we hold within us. And and if we're going to do that justice, if we're going to do that task justice, right? Actually think about our society, our collectivities as individuals and collectivities and what they face. Um, uh, then we have to reckon with the profound reality of injustice. Like, in a way, you can almost imagine Frantz Fanon saying, I didn't become a psychologist because I was a revolutionary. I became a revolutionary because I was a psychologist, which is his autobiography in a way, right? Is like after being a psychologist with these colonists and then with these natives, and just being like, well, now I see this picture now. I see something I didn't see before. If you were to come, because I mean, in a way, that's what a novelist is doing. They're doing a kind of individual and collective psychology, in order to understand their characters. And if you're doing it right, your characters are writing your story for you in a way, right? They're going to tell you what they would do and what they're going to say. Um, if you're any good, I think. So I think that's where that sits, right? Is like if you're going to write plays or novels or even short stories. I mean, if you look at these short stories, he's sort of like reflecting on his day. He's reflecting on something that happened to one of his students. He's reflecting on a trip to the hospital. Um, but if you're gonna, so something in this experience, something in seeing his student being a shoeshine boy at the street corner in town, not in the camp, for instance. So that hits him. Now he wants to write something about it. But then now he has to unpack what is this child's world. Of course, it's not too distant from his own childhood as a refugee in that same camp, because he was also a shoeshine boy on that corner in that short story that I'm actually referring to. It's sort of like he sees a younger version of him. But then if you're now saying, okay, wait, a whole like I was the first generation of people, I was a teenager when we got expelled here. But now this is the second generation, and he's living the exact same kind of squalor I lived in. He's needing to now juggle his job, shining shoes, and attendance in school. Something isn't right here. How do I think about this? How do I process this? Right? And if you're doing that with some integrity and honesty, then you understand, then no, the issue here is structural. This isn't like, oh, he just needs a change of attitude. This isn't something where like, oh, if only he thinks positive, then he can become the CEO of a bank, or he can become an NBA basketball player, whatever the ideology is kind of telling us about pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Is no, the game is rigged. This game is rigged. And now I need to think about how and why it's rigged, and then I need to think about how do we unrig it, and what am I going to think of other than there needs to be fundamental change to society? And what is revolution if not fundamental change to society, right? So I think it's somewhere here that we find this. Yeah.
Thank you. Layla, did you want to ask a question? I see you've written something in the chat. Like, feel free to either read it out or just, yeah. I'm happy to as well if you'd rather me.
I'll go ahead. Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
thank you. I enjoyed this immensely. And I'm very intrigued. I had not known that he wrote under other pen names. So now I'm thinking to go down a rabbit hole of comparing other publications, in that time period. But I just wonder what has been done so far. And yeah, where might I look for writing under his pen names?
Yeah. Do you read Arabic, Layla?
Uh, Yes, sort of.
Okay,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
that's a step. So I don't think any of the pen name stuff has been translated yet.
Hmm.
But watch this space. One of the main pen names he used was this name Faris. And
Okay.
many years ago, Dar al Adab in Beirut, I think there were two editors. I think Fawaz Trabilsi was one of them. Went and collected all of the things that were published under the name Faris in a book. And now this wonderful publishing house in Ramallah called Tibaq, who actually really focus on prison writing. But the original Faris from Dar al Adab was out of print, so they reprinted it. So that's what this is, this copy.
All
Yeah.
right.
Um, and Maqam Books here in London have copies, so
Oh, okay.
they would be
Yeah.
able to. So maqam.uk probably kind of find it if you scroll through their books.
I'll look for it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. But I think like this is an overdue project of somebody to go and just kind of collect everything that at least we know is from one of his pen names. Maybe the
Mhm.
family would hopefully cooperate. Maybe they have drafts of things. I know that um, the family worked with another publisher. I mean, comrades, but they're based in Cyprus. And there's historically there's this kind of four-volume set of the complete works of Ghassan Kanafani, and it's divided into the short stories, the novels, the plays, um, and the long-form essays. But what they did was they put out a fifth volume of they call it the Dirasat al-Siyasiyya, so the political studies. And that's actually where the copy of the 1936 revolution text that I translated was the one from here. Um, but this also has this like fascinating essay, which was a kind of like intro to Marxism that he wrote. When the party was considering adopting Marxism-Leninism, he decided to kind of deep dive that and try to like write an ABC of what it would mean to go Marxist, as it were.
Mhm.
It's a beautiful essay, actually. Um, and kind of on I think it's on the libertarian end of Marxism, not on the vanguardist end at all. But again, the Leninists really hate when I say these things. Um, so that's another kind of place to also look. But those are all things that he wrote under his name, but most of it unpublished. That's what I'm saying. So this is the stuff that
Oh,
like
okay.
wasn't read during his lifetime for the most part. Yeah.
Okay.
It also includes this wonderful piece. So um he would often identify as a journalist because he was an editor of these papers. So he'd attend these world congresses of journalists. And that's where a lot of the networking happened, like these people visiting the office. It would be through formations like that. But there were these historic meetings in the 1960s that he attended, and they were in Thailand. So he did this trip to Thailand, to China, and to India. And then he wrote up a kind of travel memoir of the trip to these three places, and that's also in here. And that had not been published. And I think several people have talked about wanting to maybe see if the family would be okay with that being translated. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
There's also a comment in the chat about the recent 1936 film. So maybe the question along the lines of like, have you seen the film?
Yes.
What's your take on it?
Well, interestingly, actually, one of the writers of the film put out a photo of her book stack of which books she had read in preparing the writing for this film, and lo and behold, um, this guy was there, which should be like obviously she should have read this. I mean, it remains probably the best book on the topic, even though it's 50 years old. It remains the statement on how to understand that revolutionary moment. I think the film's really excellent. I think, like it's hard with films that set out to do this because there's so much there. So you either you have to make a choice, I think, as a filmmaker. You either are going to kind of like pick one story, kind of like they did with that film I couldn't finish called Farha about the Nakba. You know, you take sort of like one individual, you kind of fictionalize them, and then you have them moving through different spaces. And you try to kind of like shed some light on different parts without attempting to be kind of comprehensive. Or you do what this film tries to do, which is almost kind of like ensemble it. So you have multiple main storylines that are going to kind of each again shed light on some socio-political, maybe economic process. Um, uh, or you kind of kings and queens it, right? Like where you kind of like pick someone, you posit them as the leader, and then it becomes a much more kind of Ivanhoe narrative arc of like the rise and fall. Your Braveheart, you could kind of like the Braveheart version of this story. Um, and I think what the filmmaker did was really, really admirable because what she did was she tried to do let's actually have like multiple main characters and storylines. Um, and that was what enabled her to bring in some of the class dimensions, right? Which a different version of this film would not have touched at all. And I think it's because of the Kanafani influence actually that she felt she had to have that there. So you have a Palestinian collaborator, like basically like this very wealthy man in the film, who it turns out is fully in cahoots with the Zionists. And his wife is a journalist, and she's dealing with the fact of the patriarchy. And so she's having to publish under a man's name, but she's doing this very kind of hard-hitting type of journalism. Um, and and then you have the villagers, and then she does do this thing where she does try to anchor it around this one village, El Bassa, um, and the story of El Bassa and the collective punishment visited upon it by Ord Wingate, who was the British officer who trained the Zionist military in collective punishment, who also has streets named after him in every Israeli city. Um, so I think it's as good, and then you had the dock workers, you had the craft workers, you had the it's also one of the really things I think was really important about this film is it doesn't try to bring in the Zionists very much. They sort of sit in the backdrop. And the reason I think that's important is um, we can anachronistically talk about the 1936 revolution as Palestinians versus Zionists, but that's not what it was, right? The 1936 revolution was against British occupation. And one of the many crimes of the British, one of the many grievances that the indigenous population had against this British colonizer was that it was using its military occupation to fully fund and facilitate Zionist settler colonialism. And so the primary contradiction wasn't that kind of indigenous population Zionist settler colonial project. It was indigenous population and this British imperial project. And Zionist settler colonialism was almost like part of the strategy of the British imperial project, but it wasn't the main fight. The main fight was with the British Army. And so you can imagine another filmmaker going down this thing and kind of anachronistically making this a Palestine versus Israel story that it wasn't.
Any more questions or reflections? I'm just looking through the chat. So there's a comment from Lindsay in the chat about the structure of about the film, but whether it actually utilizes elements of Kanafani's structure in the film.
The film, so Kanafani's book is four main chapters. There's a chapter on the workers, a chapter on the peasantry, a chapter on the intellectuals, and then a chapter kind of telling the story of the revolution. Um, not so much as a play-by-play, but there's a certain set of themes that he establishes that he then kind of pulls through the thread of how he narrates the revolution. The chapter narrating the revolution and the film are not very closely connected. I mean, you can read this chapter and then much better understand the film. You can watch the film and it'll kind of give you a visual while you're reading the book when you're seeing the dock workers and the Jewish workers are getting better treatment and better pay. Like, oh yeah, the stats are in here, this kind of thing. But the film does not take the chapter on the, like for instance, Izzeddin al-Qassam is mentioned once in the film and very much in passing. Izzeddin al-Qassam is mentioned on every third page of this book. Um, um, Haj Amin al-Husseini is not mentioned at all in the film. Haj Amin al-Husseini is the second protagonist of this book, also every fourth or fifth page. Uh, the book really, some of the most brilliant parts of this book are about how the poets affected. I mean, I've been calling it the newsletter of the revolution. You have a largely illiterate population, 86% agriculturalists, with no real need for learning to read and write. But also you have the beginnings of kind of elementary education, so more and more people learning to read and write. But then you have the kids of the elite being sent off to higher education. And unlike their peers in Egypt or Lebanon or Algeria or elsewhere, where they can come back and start to kind of like try to do this Renaissance project of building their country, they're facing a British military imperial occupation and a Zionist settler colonial project, and they're kind of blocked every which way. And so in Kanafani's kind of telling, a lot of them switch over into, well, the only way I'm going to be able to self-actualize is if we get rid of this occupation, this imperialism, this settler colonial onslaught. And so he put so much effort to kind of talk about the cultural aspect of building a revolutionary consciousness through poetry, through vernacular poetry, or through kind of zajal, this sort of like these traditions of poetry that would be recited in weddings or these kind of like poetry duels. And he manages to excavate some of the actual verses themselves. So you get these kind of beautiful quotes from the poetry and stuff like this. I don't think we saw any of that in the film. So no, I don't think there was in any way this book was treated as the backbone for the film as a narrative. I think it was treated as a kind of conceptual reminder that we need to talk about class if we're going to make this film. That like all of the Kanafani heads are going to be upset if we don't. And I think they did a good job of it. Like I think more could have been done, stuff like this, but you can always say that. It's too easy to say that. And a filmmaker has limited amount of time, limited amount of budget, limited everything. And I think what the filmmakers did was incredibly admirable. Especially that they even managed to film it in Palestine, that alone. And then if you stay through and watch the credits, it's a majority Palestinian crew, which is maybe one of the first times a film of this size is that, because that's not usually the case. So there's a lot that is admirable about the Palestine 36 film. Yeah. And obviously the writers consulted Kanafani, and you can see some of the influence of that, especially on the kind of more the class dimensions as they show up in the film. Because even this same filmmaker, if you see her older films, class does not come up at all. So it's not like this is something that she has made a strong part of her filmmaking and her practice and the stories she tells. The stories she tells are often much more about identity. And then there's the All That's Left to You film, the film about the kind of like 1968, where they're in the kind of military training camps in Jordan. The characters are all quite like on level. You don't get a sense of class. But in this film, like it's very present and it's necessary.
Maybe we could have another couple of questions or comments,
when I
reflection.
saw you. Yeah.
Also thinking about for any young people here who've been part of Seeds groups, if you want to ask them any questions or um, okay, well, I mean, again, thinking about my own sometimes like looking through kind of Funny's oeuvre, you get kind of surprised at how much different kind of heterogeneous material there is there. But in that book that you held up before, there's also pictures of his sculptures, and it was really interesting to see these kind of like almost avant-garde shapes. And I was wondering if you know anything about these kind of quite mysterious sculptures. I could see there was like they kind of like looked a bit like some of the propaganda posters he made, but in kind of sculptural form in a way.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I unfortunately do not know almost anything about his work as a sculptor. I know some of the kind of paintings. Um, again, he was an art teacher. He was kind of like inclined towards this, but talking to some of his comrades, a lot of these emerged as doodles from when he was bored in meetings. So very
maybe.
productive doodling. But yeah, I unfortunately do not know absolutely anything. Like I don't know the sculptures, I don't know where they are, I don't know the stories behind them. But I would believe that he would. I can imagine them talking to the poster art, that kind of aesthetic. Which, by the way, we talk about it as poster art, but the real archive of this artwork is the cover pages for the magazines he edited. So if you got the series of El Hadaf that he edited, the covers are that. Like a lot of them are things that were initially produced as posters, and a lot of them would go on to become posters. But that was very much the kind of vibe that he would bring into. You can almost imagine him talking to whoever the designer was, right? It's like, this is the aesthetic we're looking for.
Would anyone maybe like to ask a final question?
This might be a very basic question, but did he have children before he was murdered? Has he got children carrying on his legacy at all?
Yeah, he did have children, and actually, I mean, his widow really was the standard bearer for his legacy and remains so. She's getting on in years, but I mean, well into her 80s, she was still. So they established something called the Ghassan Kanafani Foundation, I want to say, but their main organization was these and remains these kindergartens and these elementary schools, and you'll find them in Lebanon and in Palestine and probably in Syria. I don't know if they exist in Jordan. And they adopted a pedagogy that I don't know enough about the different schools of pedagogy to be like it's this and it's that, but there's something kind of Montessorian about it. So my one experience, for instance, in a Kanafani school in I think it was either Shatila camp or Burj al Barajne camp in Beirut. Um, the teachers had the students assigned the students. These are children, quite young, like 6 and 7 year olds, maybe even 5 and 6 and 7 year olds, and the teachers assigned the students to build an exact model replica of the classroom, and like that was it. And so, and kind of guided from the back, but effectively, like the students had to figure out how to create a unit of measurement, and so they picked one of the students' shoes. and they measured all the dimensions of the classroom using this shoe. And they got this teacher to help with the height stuff, so to get them kind of like pick them up, and they're measuring this shoe with a pencil, like one shoe at a time. And then they come back and they did the schema based on how many shoe lengths for each part of the classroom and where the windows were and where the posters were and things like this. And then they had a discussion about what materials they were going to use to build the replica, and then how they were going to execute actually constructing this replica from the schema. So it was this kind of thing, right? This is like the Kanafani schools were teaching people to be leaders and to be kind of like to think, and to think critically and to think creatively and to be brilliant. So that legacy definitely was carried on through those schools. And they carry his name, and it really was Annie who made that happen. And I think Layla, the daughter, plays a very important role in carrying it on today. And there are other kids, but I think like in terms of that institutionalized legacy, it was Annie and then Layla.
I actually got this book by Annie Kanafani, which is like a kind of memoir of Kanafani's life. But if people can see that, there's a picture of Kanafani with his two kids.
With the two kids,
Also, Sarah has a question. Sarah, do you want to speak it, or do you want me to speak it?
Yeah, no, I can ask it.
Go for it.
I was just wondering if there's any fun or interesting anecdotes that you have about Ghassan Kanafani, since you know so much about his life and his work. Just to kind of end it on a light note.
I don't know if we can do light notes. I'm sure. I think he had like a really caustic sense of humor. I don't know any kind of like. Ask me in a couple of years, because I'm hoping to work on something where I'll learn a lot more anecdotes. But I will say that one of my first encounters with like a text he had written was in one of these sort of expanded letters to the editor sections, where a Palestinian professor from the United States had written this like Palestine is not Vietnam, so guerrilla warfare is no good for us type of article. And he's like, we don't have in Palestine the valleys and jungles they have in Vietnam and stuff. And so basically Kanafani had written something, this guy responds. No, they'd gotten a military strategist to write something, and then this professor in the US responds and is like, we shouldn't be talking about Vietnam because it's really different because we don't have jungles in Palestine. And then Kanafani responds to this response, and it's so hilariously caustic. Like he kind of, I don't know if this is a light note, but he rips him a new asshole basically with this kind of like get out of here with your jungles, like this is not a jungle does not guerrilla warfare make kind of thing. But I don't have the kind of like old uncle stories of like one time somebody came to Ghassan, four men walk in on Ghassan, and the first is Irish and the second is Scottish and the third is well. I don't have any of those. Sorry though. I wish I did. And now kind of like have set an intention to make sure to gather more. So thank you for that. Next time.
Well, thank you so much, Hazem, for everything and for taking the time to be with us tonight. It was like a really fascinating talk, and what we can do from our end is send out some resources and a link to the recording of this talk to be shared. We'll also send some links for where to donate in terms of like both me and Nadia organize with different activist groups, and we've been raising money for different mutual aid collectives in Gaza, especially. And I think, more so than anything, the real legacy of Kanafani's life and work is, kind of now, especially in, just thinking about the wave of strikes and protests that are going on in Italy today and tomorrow, and thinking about Kanafani. How he would have viewed these examples of internationalist solidarity, which I think is so comes through in everything he writes. And I think what you were saying, Hazem, about identity is so important. Identity is not a given, it's a choice, and it's something to work through. And I think with that, we can all become more deeply engaged with the Palestinian struggle and be able to express international solidarity in deeper ways. So yeah, thank you, Hazem, and thank you, everyone, for coming.
It's a real honor. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. See you later.
Bye bye.